Back with our final podcast with Maria de Lancastre Valente from SRS Legal in Portugal. And today we're speaking about other relevant employment law topics in Portugal. I'll hand over to Sean.
Hello again. So in the last podcast, we covered employee representative bodies in Portugal. But we thought we'd kick off today asking about sector level bargaining agreements. Maria, I wonder if you could explain a little about them and how they work, because that's not something we have in the UK.
Right. So I think that the main point to convey is that under Portuguese law, employee representation structures operate based on a principle of affiliation. So employees can join and can set up works councils, and they can set up trade union associations, and employers can set up their associations. And then they have obviously certain rights, and they're entitled to certain rights, and employers have to observe certain obligations. The concept of sector bargaining agreement per se doesn't exist. In the sense that when they're born, the collective bargaining agreements are born between a trade union association and an employers association. What happens is that in some sectors, they may be extended, given their relevance, by the government through what we call an extension regulation to cover the whole sector. So they will exist for a specific sector when the government decides that it is relevant to extend certain rights and obligations, and to ensure harmonization between rights and obligations across a certain sector.
Perfect. So one other thing that we often get requests from clients from is in relation to employee handbooks, and particularly where they've got employees in other jurisdictions. We're often asked if we can arrange for the UK handbook to be adapted for those jurisdictions. So are handbooks quite common in Portugal, and what do they typically contain, if so?
Handbooks are common, certainly within sort of a multinational environment, and I share what you've just said, to the extent that we get asked about that as well. I think the main and they are relevant. They will cover. There isn't any restriction. So if you remember from previous podcasts, I mentioned that. Basically, Portuguese employment law is governed by a labour code, and the labour code contains regimes that go into quite a lot of detail and that address the full life cycle of the contract. So the main source will be the labour code, and then you will have employment contracts. In some instances, you can have collective bargaining agreements that sit above the labour code. Employee handbooks are relevant to ensure harmonisation across jurisdictions, certainly, and I think that is a scenario where we see many requests, and they can be adapted. Harmonisation will not be fully possible because we do have a different approach to the law, but they can cover issues related to main terms and conditions, any benefits that the employer offers, and that it wants to communicate a certain message across either that their certain benefits will apply to certain groups of employees depending on their roles, and what employees have to do to obtain those benefits, or any issues that may be more sensitive from a corporate cultural perspective. Those can certainly be contained and can be outlined in handbooks. But a handbook isn't a source of law, and it may or may not be a source contractual terms and conditions depending on how it's worded. I mean, that they're useful. In many instances, they will be used to complement whatever else exists in a contract or even in the law. Wording obviously should be taken into consideration, the way they're worded, and they will address matters related to the organization and sort of the day-to-day life of the employment contract. Where there are substantial differences will relate to matters governing obviously termination, grievances, disciplinary dismissal, because those are governed by mandatory law. So in some instances, they may not have the use that a company wishes to attribute to them, because those regimes are already governed by law.
That's very interesting. And now moving on to a completely different topic, I thought we ought to cover something that's been an issue in lots of different jurisdictions, which is the massive increase in remote working associated with the pandemic, and probably accelerating a trend which was happening anyway. In the UK, home working, or at least part-time home working, so hybrid working, seems to be here to stay. We don't have any specific legislation that applies to this type of working, but we know that many European countries do. What's the position in Portugal?
So it's a very interesting phenomenon we've been seeing, because the concept of remote work has existed in our labour code since 2003. And over the years, it remained dormant, I'd say, especially within a more national environment. So companies didn't pay, and employers didn't pay a lot of attention to it. I think there's also a cultural aspect that's relevant, that the idea that in order to be productive, you have to sit at your desk and in an office to do that. I don't think this is an issue that's particular to Portugal. I'd say it's probably relevant to other jurisdictions with the same legal background as Portugal. But what we saw obviously was that in 2020 things changed completely. And obviously we've demonstrated that working from home or working remotely works. And legally that had to be addressed. So during the pandemic, we had legislation that was produced on a daily basis to cover exceptional measures. And then at the end of last year, we had a significant change to the Labour Code that introduced a number of measures to regulate remote work further. Some of them relate to costs and to company equipment, and in what cases or to what extent employers have to contribute towards employees' costs when they're working from home or working remotely. And also with a particular concern surrounding, the right to rest and to make sure that employees are observing their rest periods and they're not working from home more than they should be, basically. So I think that the whole idea around remote work has certainly changed. I think in Portugal, I think the issue hasn't been closed. I think more changes will come. Companies are trying to bring back employees into the office. I agree with you, Sian, that we're looking at, or that many companies are now looking at the hybrid regime as a balanced way of approaching work. To what extent what we have in the Labour Code is sufficient or not, I'm not sure. Certainly the issue surrounding costs has been one that has gained a lot of relevance politically from the media as well, and from unions to some extent. But employees have been persistent in also conveying that they want to stay and work from home at least part of their time. So I think that there's a movement that is pushing both the legislator and companies to think about solutions that will offer their employees that comfort that they're looking for. And it's a question of trying to understand whether that equilibrium, that balance has been reached or not. But I agree that it's something that certainly in the short, medium term is here to stay. And that we have legislation. The new changes also address the limitations to remote work, in the sense that remote work can be stopped or terminated unilaterally by employer or employee, and also that there are some instances where remote work is a right, is an entitlement. So in particular for groups, for categories of employees, for those who have children, there are instances where an employee can request that they be placed under a fully remote work regime, and provided they fulfill certain requirements, the employer cannot validly refuse that. So I think it's here to stay. To what extent we will see further changes, I think we will, especially in relation to the costs piece, and how remote work is going to be calibrated. I think we're all in the same boat there.
Definitely, it's still kind of still working through how it all play out, and I completely agree that it's here to stay. So final question in these series, is there any other issues you would like to flag for businesses employing people in Portugal?
I think the main issues have already been addressed, and I think in the previous podcast, in the initial podcast, I think I spoke about this, and in the second one as well. The advice I would give is obviously companies aren't expected to dominate knowledge or to have extensive knowledge on Portuguese employment law. I think it's more about trying to understand what questions HR professionals and legal counsel have to be asking, or and what issues they need to be looking at in order to make sure that that employment relationships flow easily. And also recognizing that, and I'm going to focus on this aspect as well, on culture, not only organizational culture, but Portuguese culture. Obviously, employment relations depend on interaction between individuals. A company is a group, ultimately a group of individuals who is taking and making decisions. And I think that one of the, certainly in my experience, sometimes the challenges are not so much in sorting out the legal aspects, but in sorting out cultural differences and making sure that cultural communication is obviously mutually respected. And if those ingredients, are all taken into consideration, I think that makes the life of both companies, employees much easier. I would also say that to the extent possible, you have to prepare. It's not a jurisdiction where you can typically implement decisions quickly without that having consequences or without that being neutral. A company or a client should also take into consideration that if there are changes that are going to be made, that if possible, it should prepare those changes in advance to ensure that, you know, the right decisions can be made, taking into consideration, you know, time, cost, and risk, which for me are the three ingredients that also hold and that also are relevant to providing also sound advice. So I think these are the issues that I would flag out.
That's great, and that's definitely good advice, and we certainly would echo what you were saying about the cultural issues being really important. Well, that wraps up our series on employment law in Portugal. So thank you, Maria. It's been incredibly interesting.
Thank you. Very welcome, and thank you for having me.
That's great. And if anyone would like any further information on the topics we've been discussing in this series, please do get in touch with us or Maria, and please join us in our next series of podcasts. Thank you.